Welcome back to Reformed Thinking.
We're here again for another deep dive, and today we're taking on a huge topic.
We are. We're going to be working through a section of John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. The goal here is pretty straightforward. We want to give you a structured analysis of the source material.
And this isn't just Calvin offering his opinions. What's so compelling is that he builds his entire case using historical documents. He's citing council records, letters from early church fathers, and detailing specific disputes.
So this is a deep structural analysis. We're looking at how institutions rise and, well, how they decline.
We're really trying to discern the difference between the ancient church order and what came later. The focus is on the specific, documented, historical process.
Okay, so let's frame this for you. Our mission is to trace the historical roadmap that Calvin lays out. We're looking at how the Bishop of Rome went from being, a respected peer among other leaders.
A first among equals, you might say.
Right, and how that position incrementally grew, gathering more and more authority, until it became this claim of absolute universal headship.
A monarchy, really. And Calvin's whole argument is that this monarchy fundamentally oppressed the freedom of the ancient church.
So we're tracing the chain of events, using the evidence Calvin himself used, to see how geographical prestige eventually morphed into a claim of divine right.
Let's get into it.
To really get a handle on how things changed, we have to start at the beginning. With the structural foundation of the early church. The big ecumenical councils.
You have to.
Let's start with the Council of Nicaea in 325 A.D. What do those earliest, most respected documents actually say about the Roman bishop's position?
Well, the records from Nicaea give us a baseline, and it's a baseline that just profoundly contradicts the later papal claims.
In what way?
Calvin points out that, yes, the Roman bishop was granted the first place among the patriarchs. It was an honor, a position of prestige, but that honor came with very specific, very clearly defined limits. The council decreed he was, and this is the key phrase, ordered to take care of the suburbicarian churches.
That phrase, suburbicarian churches, sounds technical, but it's critical for understanding the original limits, isn't it?
It's everything. The suburbicarian churches were essentially the dioceses in the immediate vicinity of Rome, his local region.
So it's basically his backyard.
It's his backyard. The council is saying, this is your zone of direct oversight. And by assigning him specific regional boundaries, it very clearly signals that he was one chief overseeing one region.
Just like the patriarchs of Alexandria or Antioch were overseeing theirs.
Precisely. He was a regional superintendent with a great deal of honor, but he wasn't the global CEO. The structure was collegial.
And Calvin doesn't just stop at the written decree. He points to the visual evidence, the seating arrangement at the council.
Yeah, the optics, as we'd say today. If the Bishop of Rome, Julius, at that time, was truly seen as the supreme head by divine right, you'd expect his representatives to be front and center running the show.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. His delegates, Vetus and Vincentius, when they showed up, they were given the fourth place in the proceedings.
Fourth place. Not first.
And even more telling, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, was the one who presided over this universal council.
So you have the Bishop of Alexandria presiding, and Rome's guys are sitting several seats down.
It's just compelling, verifiable historical evidence that a universal monarchical supremacy was not the recognized order in the early 4th century. Rome was respected, but it was not sovereign over the whole church.
So as we move forward in time into the 4th and 5th centuries, this whole issue of who gets to preside over the big councils becomes a major point of contention. It's a fault line that Calvin really zeroes in on.
It is.
How did the Roman bishops start to, let's say, manufacture prestige at these later gatherings?
Yeah.
What happened at the Council of Ephesus?
At Ephesus, you can really see the shift from accepted custom to conscious political maneuvering. Celestine, the Roman pontiff at the time, he knew that Cyril of Alexandria was slated to preside. It was his right, based on his standing in the council's location.
So he was facing a situation where his see wouldn't be in the top spot.
Exactly. And to get around this, Celestine comes up with a clever solution. He formally designates Cyril as his proxy.
Ah, so it's a strategic move.
Calvin calls it a trick. It was a way to formally attach the name of the Roman see to the first seat, a kind of appropriation of dignity, even though his actual delegates were sitting lower down giving their opinions like everyone else. It shows that Rome was aware it didn't have an inherent right to preside and had to find other ways to look supreme.
And this situation gets even more revealing at the Second Council of Ephesus in 449. the one that gets labeled the Robber Council.
Yes, because of the violence and coercion involved. But for Calvin's argument, what happens there is a moment of, stunning historical honesty.
Because the Roman delegates just yield.
They yield the presidency without a fight. Leo's representatives were there, but they let Dioscorus of Alexandria take the chair without any contention. And for Calvin, this is the proof point.
Why is that so significant?
Because, as he argues, Roman bishops were famously ambitious. He says they were never ashamed to raise the greatest contentions for their own honors. So the fact that Leo's delegates just let it go
Proves they knew they didn't have a right to it.
It proves the first place was not theirs by right or by custom. If it had been a divine right, they would have fought tooth and nail for it. Their silence speaks volumes.
Which makes the next council, Chalcedon in 451, so interesting. Because there, Rome's representatives did get the first seat.
They did. But the key, as Calvin dissects it, is how they got it.
It wasn't by right.
It was by explicit concession. Leo himself basically admitted this. He petitioned the Emperor Marcian and the Empress Pulcheria for the privilege.
And what was his justification?
He argued it was a matter of necessity. He claimed the previous moderators, the Eastern bishops at that disastrous robber council, had been so disorderly and unfit that someone else needed to take charge to ensure order.
So it was framed as an emergency measure.
It was secured purely as an extraordinary privilege based on a temporary crisis. It was a special favor, not a customary law. And that distinction between a special privilege and an established rule is just central to Calvin's entire argument about how this power was gradually usurped.
And if the structure was really supposed to be collegial, we should be able to find examples of other non-Roman bishops presiding over major councils.
And we do. These examples confirm that authority was decentralized. Take the Council of Carthage. A hugely important council. Augustine himself was present.
And who presided there?
Aurelius, the Archbishop of Carthage. Wow. He presided even at a time when the specific authority of the Roman pontiff was being actively debated and challenged by that very council. They didn't feel the need to wait for a Roman legate to run their meeting.
There was even a universal council held in Italy itself, but not in Rome.
Right. The Council of Aquileia. It was held in Italy, and it was presided over by Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, not the Roman bishop.
So at that point in time, Milan See was more illustrious.
In many ways, yes. Calvin suggests its spiritual and intellectual influence was arguably greater at that moment. It just demonstrates that honor and jurisdiction were often based on the personal prestige of the bishop or the secular standing of the city, not on some single recognized monarchical head established by Peter. The picture is one of regional autonomy.
So the council records paint a very clear picture of the structure, but the language they use with each other in, day-to-day communications, that also tells a story.
Oh, absolutely. The early titles and greetings are powerful evidence of a peer relationship.
Like Cyprian writing to Cornelius in Rome.
Exactly. Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, calls Cornelius, the Bishop of Rome, brother, fellow bishop, or colleague.
Those are terms of equality.
Complete equality. Fraternal co-equality. You don't call your sovereign monarch colleague. And it goes further. When Cyprian wrote to Stephen, who succeeded Cornelius, he spoke, as Calvin puts it, rather sternly to him, criticizing his arrogance.
So he felt free to admonish the Bishop of Rome.
Without fear. That freedom shows they saw each other as equals in dignity and authority.
And the African Church, which seems to have been a consistent source of resistance to Rome's growing ambition, actually went so far as to codify this rejection of unique titles.
They did. They put it into the council's rules. The Council of Carthage explicitly forbade anyone, and that included the Bishop of Rome, from being called Prince of Priests or First Bishop.
So what title did they allow?
A very moderate one. The only permissible title was Bishop of the Prime See. And Calvin notes that for a good while, the Roman bishop was content with the simple, common title of brother. It just makes the later invention of titles like Supreme Pontiff seem like a radical departure from the ancient church.
Now, to really hammer home the theological point that a bishop's rank shouldn't be based on his city's zip code, Calvin brings in a witness from inside Rome itself, Jerome.
Yes, Jerome, a Roman presbyter in the late 4th century, and he just provides the theological hammer. He completely dismantles the argument for geographical supremacy.
What was his core argument?
He shifted the whole perspective away from the secular prestige of the city of Rome and back to the spiritual reality of the bishop's office. He stated it so bluntly. If authority is sought, The world is greater than a city.
That line is just brutal.
It is. He's basically saying your city's fame doesn't make you holier or more authoritative. He rebuked the arrogance that was growing in Rome and asserted the absolute parity of the office of bishop.
So bishop is a bishop is a bishop.
No matter where he is, that was Jerome's point. Whether he's in Rome, or in a tiny obscure town like Gubbio, or in the new capital of Constantinople, his merit and his priesthood are the same. Wealth or poverty, he said, do not make a bishop higher or lower. And coming from a Roman presbyter, that testimony just fundamentally guts the later claims of a divine right for Roman supremacy.
Okay, this brings us to what might be the single strongest historical point in Calvin's case. The huge dispute in the late 6th century involving Pope Gregory the First over the title universal bishop.
This is the historical linchpin, because the argument against the title comes from a highly respected pope himself.
Oh, what happened?
The whole thing blew up when John the Faster, who was the patriarch of Constantinople, started styling himself as ecumenical, or universal bishop.
And Gregory the First did not like that.
He responded with utter shock and just a fierce protest. But what's so critical to understand is why he protested. He didn't argue that the title belonged to him, to Rome. He denounced the title itself, full stop.
What kind of language did he use?
He called the title profane, sacrilegious, and in his most famous phrase, he said, anyone who uses it is the very precursor of Antichrist.
So this wasn't just about humility. He saw a deep theological danger in the title itself.
A catastrophic danger. He argued that it put the entire church at risk. His reasoning was the whole church falls from its condition if anyone who is called universal falls. One man becomes a single point of failure for everyone.
It's an enormous spiritual liability.
And he didn't stop there. He connected the pride of seeking such a unique title to the devil himself, who tried to climb to the pinnacle of uniqueness, rejecting fellowship with the other angels.
But he also had a very practical and institutional concern about what this title would do to the church structure.
Yes, he said that if one person is called universal, then the title of patriarch is stripped away from all the other bishops. It destroys their due honor. He said his own predecessors in Rome had refused this title for that very reason, lest when something was given exclusively to one, all bishops should be deprived of their due honor.
Now, Calvin does note that Gregory was actually mistaken on a point of fact. He thought the title had been offered to a previous pope, Leo, at Chalcedon.
He was mistaken about that. It's not in the Acts of the Council. But that factual error doesn't matter for the principle.
Right. His theological rejection of the title itself is what stands.
It stands firm. Gregory Hef unequivocally denounced the title as wicked, profane, abominable, proud, and sacrilegious, indeed devised by the devil. This is the key moment. At a time when the See of Rome held enormous prestige, its greatest leader explicitly condemned the central claim that would later define the papacy. Any claim to inherent universal supremacy has to somehow get around the direct condemnation from Pope Gregory the Great.
All right, so we've seen the principles of co-equality in the early church. Now we need to transition to the actual historical mechanisms that allowed Roman jurisdiction to grow beyond those ancient boundaries.
This is where the story shifts from, canonical order to what looks a lot like political opportunism.
And it seems like external crises were the main driver.
They really were. Crisis creates opportunity. In the 4th and 5th centuries, you have the Arian factions just tearing the Eastern churches apart.
And this created refugees.
It did. Orthodox defenders, men like the great Athanasius, were persecuted, thrown out of their own churches. They were forced to seek asylum in the West, and specifically in Rome. And in their moment of desperation, they were willing to grant the Roman See a level of authority they never would have under normal circumstances.
So their desperate need for an ally, for political and financial support, started to blur the lines. Communion with Rome started to feel like a necessity for orthodoxy.
That's it. They needed help, and Rome was the place to get it. So this process began where being in communion with the Roman Church was seen not just as fellowship between equals, but as a crucial tool to strengthen the pious and defend the truth. And of course, Rome was more than happy to be seen as the ultimate refuge of orthodoxy.
And once you open that door, as Calvin describes it, evil and wicked men start to see an opportunity. They start using Rome as a kind of a loophole to escape local justice.
This system of appeals becomes the real engine of jurisdictional growth. It was a vital mechanism for Rome.
Now get work.
You'd have presbyters who were condemned by their local bishop, or even bishops condemned by their regional synods in places like Gaul or Africa. And what do? They immediately appeal to Rome.
It's a way to get out of trouble.
It's a naked attempt to flee a lawful judgment. And Calvin notes that the Roman bishops received these appeals more avidly than they should have. They saw a chance to meddle in business far and wide, often siding with the wrong cause simply because it expanded their own jurisdiction.
And this audacity, this grabbing of judicial power, eventually led to organized resistance, specifically from those African bishops again.
The African bishops, men like Augustine, were fierce guardians of their local autonomy. They were not going to let this happen.
So they fought back.
They did. At the councils of Carthage and Milevis, they passed a decree that no one should appeal beyond the sea, meaning to Rome, under penalty of excommunication. It was a direct shot across the bow, trying to shut down the Roman appeal system for good.
And how did Rome respond to that?
The Roman pontiff tried to get the decree overturned, and his argument was that the privilege to hear these appeals had been granted to Rome by the universally respected Council of Nicaea.
Wait, he claimed Nicaea gave them this power, and this leads directly to the forgery scandal that Calvin details.
It does. It's an incredible story. The Roman legates show up in Africa with documents from their own archives, supposedly from Nicaea, backing up their claim.
But the Africans were suspicious.
They were meticulous. They refused to just take Rome's word for it. They sent their own people to Constantinople and other cities in Greece to find older, more reliable copies of the Nicene Acts.
And what did they find?
The discovery was damning. They found that, as Calvin puts it, no such thing as the Romans had pretended was written. It was a complete fabrication.
So what had Rome done?
They'd been caught red-handed, substituting the canons of the Synod of Sardica, a smaller, much earlier local council, for the canons of the Great Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. Sardica had granted some limited appeal rights to the Pope at the time, but Nicaea had not.
That is just blatant institutional deceit. They tried to pass off a fake document to establish universal judicial authority.
It's political corruption documented inside the ancient church, and Calvin points out it didn't stop there. Later, an even more shameful forgery appeared, a letter where a Carthaginian bishop supposedly begs for pardon because his predecessor had resisted the apostolic see. It just reveals the cynical mechanism behind this rise to power.
And this gradual creep of jurisdiction wasn't just in judicial appeals. It was happening with routine things like ordaining bishops and calling councils.
Yes, the same pattern. Ancient councils were clear. Bishops should be ordained by the metropolitan bishop within their own province. Rome's direct authority was limited to its own patriarchate.
So how did that change?
It started as a voluntary courtesy. A distant province might invite a Roman legate to witness an ordination as a sign of fellowship. But over generations, what started as voluntary recognition slowly hardened into a compulsory right. Courtesy became jurisdiction.
And when it came to calling the big universal councils, the Roman bishop simply didn't have the power he later claimed.
The historical reality is crystal clear. Only the emperor could call a universal council. The Roman bishop was summoned just like all the others. If he had tried to summon all of Christendom on his own authority, it would have been rejected out of hand.
The story then takes a major turn when the Western Roman Empire begins to fall apart. This chaos becomes the fertile ground for Rome's political consolidation.
It does. The whole focus shifts to worldly stability, the collapse of the empire, the constant invasions across Gaul, Spain, Italy. Bishops were desperate for an anchor.
And Rome was that anchor.
It became an island of relative stability in a sea of total chaos. So bishops naturally started to ally themselves more closely with Rome. They needed an institution that could survive, and Rome offered that. This greatly increased its prestige, and with that, its temporal power.
But it's so important to remember that even during this period, a figure like Gregory the Great, who we've already discussed, still held a very limited view of his own authority. He wasn't acting like a monarch.
No, not at all. Gregory's view was carefully balanced. He said he had jurisdiction only to correct those who sinned. But when there was no fault, he insisted, all are equal according to the order of humility.
That's a profoundly anti-monarchical statement.
It is, and he openly saw himself as subject to the emperor. We have records of him waiting for the emperor's direct command before he would act as a judge in a case involving the primate of Byzantium. He wasn't above the secular order.
And we know from his own letters that he wasn't happy about all these new secular duties.
He complained bitterly about them. Calvin quotes him lamenting that he's been drawn back into the world by all these administrative affairs. He wished he could just focus on his pastoral duties. So even this great Roman bishop in the 6th century saw the accumulation of worldly power as a distraction, not a divine right.
This brings us to the core reason for Rome's initial primacy, which was entirely secular. It was a clash over the prestige of place.
Yes. Why was Rome first in the first place? The reason was simple. It was the imperial capital. That's it.
And so when the empire got a second capital,
Constantinople. This immediately created a rivalry based on the exact same principle. The Council of Constantinople decreed that the bishop of that city, the new Rome, should have privileges of honor second only to old Rome.
and this idea, this geographical reasoning, terrified the Roman bishops. Pope Leo fought against it bitterly.
He did. And Calvin argues his protest was based purely on ambition, not on preserving ancient tradition. Leo was afraid that as the glory of old Rome faded, Constantinople would use the same secular argument to claim the top spot.
So the hierarchy was based on the temporal power of the empire. A rule Rome was happy to use when it was on top, but rejected when its status declined.
Precisely, they needed a spiritual claim to replace the fading secular one.
The story then moves from this rivalry to just blatant, cynical political deal-making. This is what finally secured Rome's official headship.
This is the turning point. The controversy over the universal title wasn't settled by a church council. It was settled by a military usurper named Phocas.
What was the deal?
Phocas had murdered the legitimate emperor Maurice. He was a tyrant who needed legitimacy, and he needed it fast. So he made a deal with Pope Boniface III. In 607 AD, Phocas granted Boniface the headship of all churches.
It was a political exchange.
For a clear quid pro quo, Phocas got the friendship of the influential Roman bishop after his bloody coup, and in return, Rome got official ecclesiastical supremacy. It was a deal made with a murderer.
But the truly decisive deal for Western Europe, the one that completely changed the church structure there, was the alliance between Pepin and Pope Zacharias a century later.
That transaction cemented papal supremacy not through any spiritual revival, but through a political deal involving treason. Pepin wanted to overthrow the lawful king of the Franks. Pope Zacharias helped him do it.
And in return?
In return for helping with this perfidy and robbery, as Calvin calls it, the Roman see was granted jurisdiction over all the churches of Gaul.
Calvin's description of this is just shocking in its bluntness.
He compares them to robbers dividing up their loot. Pepin gets the crown of a kingdom, and Zacharias gets spiritual control over it as his share of the spoils. This power was then strengthened by Charlemagne for similar political reasons. And at that point, Calvin concludes, the old ancient form of the church was utterly wiped out in Gaul and Germany. The jurisdiction was established by royal decree, rooted in political corruption.
So after these political deals solidified Rome's power, the trajectory just accelerates toward moral and spiritual decay. And now we have to jump forward several centuries to the 12th century to see how people within the church were reacting to this.
Yes, and this is crucial. Calvin brings in Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most respected spiritual figures of that era. Bernard's critique, written 400 years before the Reformation, shows this wasn't a new problem.
What kind of picture did Bernard paint?
A horrifying one. He described Rome as a place where the ambitious, the greedy, the simoniacs people buying and selling church offices all converged to get church honors by invoking the Pope's authority.
He wasn't just criticizing the Pope, but the whole culture of the institution.
The entire system. He said that fraud, deception, and violence have prevailed in Rome. He saw a system built on getting favors and money, not on dispensing justice or teaching piety.
He had a particularly sharp critique of the financial corruption, didn't he? Saying people paid more attention to the Pope's hands than his mouth.
That quote is unforgettable. He said, "Few pay attention to the mouth of the lawgiver, all to his hands. And the hands," he said, "do all the Pope's business." Bernard saw the lifeblood of the poor being spent in the streets of the rich. He said these were pastures of devils rather than of sheep. He knew the thirst for money was just eating away at the spiritual core.
And that system of appeals, the very mechanism that helped Rome grow its power, Bernard saw it as actively destroying the church's structure.
He voiced the common complaint of the time. He said the churches were being mangled and dismembered by the appeal process. It was pulling local leaders out from under their proper oversight, dragging every dispute to Rome, and completely undermining local discipline.
And what was his conclusion about the Pope's power?
A damning one. He concluded that in behaving this way, the Pope proved he had fullness of power but not of righteousness. Unchecked jurisdiction had led directly to the abandonment of justice.
So if that was the view in the 12th century, by the 16th, when Calvin is writing, these corrupt practices have hardened into absolute dogma.
They're codified into an unchallengeable monarchy. The Pope is now officially defined as the supreme head of the church on earth, the universal bishop of the whole world. the very title Gregory called sacrilegious.
And the claims just become more and more extreme.
They become exorbitant. It's asserted that the Pope's pronouncements are to be received as if they came from Peter's own divine voice, that provincial councils have no force without him, that he can ordain clergy anywhere, overriding all local authority. All power doctrine, law, discipline is vested in the Roman pontiff alone.
But the most stunning claim, the one that Calvin says formally establishes the tyranny, is the idea that the Pope has no judge on earth.
This is the one. This claim of total exemption from accountability. It dismantles any rule of law within the Church. The Romanists asserted no one has the right to review the judgments of the see, and that the judge, the Pope, will be judged neither by emperor, nor by kings, nor by all the clergy, nor by the people.
And their justification was theological?
Yes, they claimed God had reserved the Bishop of Rome for his own judgment. Calvin just highlights the extreme danger here. You set one man up as the judge of all, and he refuses to give an account for his actions, even if he exercises tyranny or throws the whole church into confusion. It's the definition of unaccountable power.
Given this history, Calvin then moves to his final break. He starts to question whether there's even a real church or a real bishopric left in Rome to inherit any of these ancient privileges.
He brings it all back to first principles. His argument is that even if all those historical claims were true, which he has just argued they are not, they're worthless unless a true church and a true bishop actually exist in Rome right now.
A place that isn't a church can't be the mother of churches.
And a man who doesn't do the job of a bishop can't be the prince of bishops.
So what are the essential non-negotiable duties of a bishop?
According to Christ's institution, there are three. First, you have to faithfully teach the Word of God. Second, you have to properly administer the sacraments. And third, you have to maintain holy discipline.
And Calvin then does a sort of an audit. Does the pontiff do any of these things?
A brutal audit. And his conclusion is that the pontiff doesn't touch any part of that essential spiritual office with his little finger. The Pope is a secular ruler concerned with wealth and politics. He's not engaged in the ministry of the word, the sacraments, or discipline. Therefore, Calvin concludes, he is no bishop.
And since there's no true bishop executing the office, Calvin identifies the institution itself as the primary source of spiritual darkness in the world.
He asserts that the papacy of his day is the source, or at least the main strength, of all the perverse doctrines, superstitions, and idolatry flooding the world. He argues the only reason the popes rage so fiercely against the gospel is self-preservation. They know their entire kingdom will collapse as soon as the pure gospel of Christ takes hold.
Which leads him to his most theologically charged claim, aimed directly at the head of this system.
Yes. He says he's speaking from the lips of the Apostle Paul, referencing 2 Thessalonians 2, when he calls the Roman pontiff Antichrist. And he's very specific about what he means by that.
It's not just an insult.
No, it's a theological definition. He says it refers to a tyranny over souls, one that operates under the mask of the church, and one that consists in depriving God of his honor to take it for oneself. The Pope cannot be Christ's vicar or Peter's successor, because his entire project is to persecute the gospel and demolish what Peter built.
And Calvin points to actual historical examples of the see falling into clear heresy, proving its doctrinal instability. The case of Pope John XXII is a big one.
That case is just undeniable proof of institutional failure. John XXII openly taught that souls are mortal and die with their bodies until the resurrection. A radical heresy.
And the cardinals didn't stop him.
That's the shocking part. None of them initially opposed this madness. It took the King of France to step in and compel the Pope to recant. A temporal king had to correct the spiritual head of the church on a core doctrine. It showed the see had utterly fallen from the faith.
The Romanists, of course, had a scriptural defense for papal infallibility. They pointed to Luke 22, where Christ says to Peter, "I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail."
Calvin calls this shameless mockery, and his rebuttal is a rhetorical masterpiece.
What's his counter-argument?
He says, okay, if you insist on applying everything said to Peter to his successors, then you have to take the bad with the good.
You can't just pick to choose the verses you like.
Exactly. And so he says, if I have prayed for you applies to all popes, then they must all be Satan's, since the Lord also said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." It just exposes the complete fallacy of their selective use of Scripture.
And beyond the heresy, the simple moral abandonment of the leadership was, for Calvin, the final proof.
He doesn't hold back at all when describing the Renaissance popes of his era, Julius, Leo, Clement. He and others describe them as men prostituted to all wickedness, filthiness, and uncleanness, resembling monsters rather than men. They were devoid of religion. So he concludes that Rome, even if it was once the head of the churches, is now not worthy of being considered among the smallest toes of the church's feet.
And the rapid rise of the cardinals provides a final, tidy little picture of this whole institutional inflation.
It's a perfect microcosm. In Gregory's time, a cardinal was just a local Roman priest, subject to the bishop. Now, in the 16th century, their status has exploded. They're called cousins of kings and emperors, they rule vast territories, they wield immense wealth.
It's a completely new role.
Utterly new. It shows how the whole hierarchy inflated itself right along with its head, deviating completely from the ancient, modest structure of the church.
So after all of that, what does this all mean? We've traced this long documented historical path from a collegial structure to a singular absolute monarchy.
The synthesis is incredibly clear, I think. The material Calvin presents shows a documented shift from an ancient church order, which was rooted in shared authority and defined boundaries, to a political monarchy. And this shift wasn't driven by apostolic succession of function, but by political expediency, by taking advantage of crises, and in some key cases, by outright fabricating legal authority.
The true spiritual office teaching discipline was just systematically sacrificed for worldly status.
That's the core of it, and the central conflict that runs through all these centuries of history is this profound contrast between two opposing models of authority.
On one hand,
On one side, you have the moderation and genuine humility of someone like Gregory the Great, who abhorred the idea of unique headship. And on the other, you have the absolute tyrannical, self-exempting claims of the later popes, who denied any accountability to any earthly authority. This contrast just illuminates how the quest for worldly influence corrupts spiritual function.
the source material ends on a heavy note, citing the prophet Malachi. You have therefore voided the covenant of Levi, says the Lord, so I have rendered you despised and abased to all the people.
And that leaves a question for you to consider. If this source material shows that seeking external power and political alliance inevitably undermined the internal spiritual integrity of a religious institution, what current institutions today, and it doesn't matter what sphere they're in, whether it's media or technology or government, risk sacrificing their original purity of purpose for worldly influence and political gain? And what are the specific warning signs, like a love of money or a refusal of accountability, that they too might eventually be rendered despised and abased in the eyes of the very people they were meant to serve?